There's a silence so profound, it doesn't just lack sound, it humbles your entire sense of self. Have you ever stood beneath a canopy of stars in a place so remote the night feels ancient? Not a car, not a voice, just you, and that strange humming quiet that isn't empty, but full, so full in fact that you feel like it's listening to you, watching, holding something sacred. You try to describe it later, but the words slip away. Because silence, real silence, is not a blank, it's a presence, a living tension, and it speaks in a language older than speech. And yet, look around, our world is allergic to silence. Every empty moment is crammed with content. Waiting in line, open Instagram, driving, turn on a podcast, sitting alone for even 30 seconds, cue the background noise. We've created an entire culture that treats silence like a threat, as if a quiet moment might expose something we don't want to hear. But that's precisely why philosophy needs silence more than ever. Because silence isn't just the absence of noise, it's the condition in which truth begins to form. It's the clearing in the forest before something sacred appears. It's the still pool in which our thoughts can finally reflect themselves without distortion. And sometimes, silence isn't passive at all. It's active. It's charged. It's the unsaid in a conversation that holds more weight than the spoken. The glance, the pause, the breath that almost becomes a sentence, but doesn't. Think about the last time someone paused before telling you something important. That heartbeat of silence said more than the words that followed. That pause was vulnerability, honesty, the mind catching up with the heart. We tend to think of speech as power, as agency, as the way we assert ourselves in the world. But what if silence is its own form of power? Not the power to dominate, but the power to reveal, to notice, to be. The philosopher Max Picard once wrote, "Silence is not merely the absence of sound. It is the presence of something greater than sound." That's what makes silence not just a sensory experience, but a philosophical one. It's a window into being itself. It's where presence begins, before it's broken into language and named and categorized, before the noise of thought rushes in. And here's the thing. We are not born into language. We are born into silence. A baby does not arrive in the world with grammar. Before we learn to speak, we learn to sense, to absorb, to watch. We live in a state of primal awareness, undivided, pre-verbal. In those early moments of life, before we're taught what to call a tree or a hand or a mother's face, we exist in pure relation. We are immersed in the world, not yet separated from it by the names we give things. Philosophers call this the pre-conceptual state, a time before thoughts take shape. It's not unintelligent, it's simply unfiltered. It's silent, not because nothing is happening, but because the self hasn't started narrating yet. And in many ways, that silence is the most honest we ever are. But then, something happens. We learn words, we learn rules, we learn the art of saying. And in doing so, we also learn to stop listening to the silence underneath everything. We become fluent in sound and illiterate in silence. Yet deep down, we still crave it. Why else do people pay money to go on silent retreats? Why do monks sit in caves for years, staring at walls? Why do people climb mountains, not just for the view, but for the quiet? Because in silence, something returns to us, something ancient, something foundational, a sense that we are not just in the world, but of it, that the deepest truths, the ones beyond language, are not spoken. They are felt, known, experienced, without translation. There is a story told in Sufi mysticism about a man who seeks wisdom from a great teacher. He travels across deserts and mountains to reach him, expecting a lecture, a lesson, a ceremony. But when he arrives, the teacher simply sits in silence. Hours pass. The visitor grows restless. He asks again and again for instruction, but the teacher says nothing. Finally, the man gives up. As he turns to leave, the teacher whispers, "Now you're ready." Because only when the noise of expectation fades can the truth make itself known. In this way, silence isn't passive, it's preparatory. It clears the ground. It burns away the superficial. It teaches you how to wait. And in waiting, how to listen. And in listening, how to understand. The real question is, can we bear it? Because silence is not always comforting. Sometimes it confronts us with our own smallness. It holds up a mirror not just to the world, but to ourselves. It shows us what's missing, what's unspoken, what we're afraid to say, or afraid to hear. And that's why we flee from it. Not because it's empty, but because it's full. But if we can learn to sit with it, not fight it, not fill it, we might just start to hear the things that matter most. Not the voices of others, not even the voice in our head, but something deeper, the voice of being itself. And that's where our journey begins. There's a line in the Tao Te Ching that says, "Those who know do not speak. Those who speak do not know." At first glance, it sounds cryptic, maybe even arrogant. But stay with it, and the paradox reveals something profound. Because in the Taoist vision of the world, language is always secondary. Reality is not what you say about it. Reality is what remains when all words fall short. The Tao, the way, is not a doctrine. It's not a creed. It's not even an idea. It's the living pulse of the world, and it cannot be spoken. To speak it is to miss it, like trying to catch a breeze in your fist. That's why the sages of old didn't argue or debate. They wandered through mountains, they watched rivers, they listened to the wind through bamboo leaves and called that wisdom. They didn't talk because they didn't need to. They were fluent in something older than speech. In the Taoist view, silence is not the absence of something, it's the presence of everything. When you are silent, you don't step back from the world. You melt into it. You stop slicing things up into names and categories. You stop trying to control. You begin to see, not with the eyes, but with awareness. You begin to hear, not sounds, but being. And that's a kind of knowledge words can't reach. This idea wasn't unique to China. Thousands of miles away, ancient Indian philosophy spoke a similar truth in a different tongue. The Upanishads, those hauntingly poetic texts of early Hindu thought, whispered that the self is not what can be spoken. It is that by which speech itself is known. In other words, what you're looking for, the core of consciousness, the soul of the soul, is not something you can say. It is the one doing the saying, the silence behind every sound, the witness behind every thought. They even had a word for it, neti neti, not this, not that. It's how the sages described the real. Every time you tried to define it, they said no. Every time you tried to label it, they took the label away. Because the truth wasn't in the words. It was what remained after the words dissolved. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Both Taoism and the Upanishads agree that the more you talk about the sacred, the farther you get from it. They didn't just tolerate silence, they revered it. They structured entire practices around it. Long periods of stillness, wordless rituals, meditation, not as a technique, but as a return, a falling back into the quiet source from which all things come. Even the gods in these traditions don't scream their divinity. They whisper, or they say nothing at all. Because silence in these philosophies is not just human, it's divine. It's how the ultimate reality expresses itself. And yet, if we look at our modern mindset, silence is often treated with suspicion. It makes us uncomfortable. We mistake it for ignorance, for awkwardness, for weakness. A pause in conversation becomes something to fill. A person who says little is someone to fix. We idolize clarity, expression, transparency. But what if wisdom doesn't always come dressed in explanation? What if it hides in the very thing we run from? The unsaid, the mysterious, the void. Imagine sitting in a room with someone who says nothing, but says it with presence. There's no performance, no anxiety, just a calm, grounded silence that invites you to settle too. It's rare and powerful because it doesn't ask for anything. It doesn't try to persuade, it just is. And in that isness, there's more communication than 1,000 speeches. This is why mystics from every tradition return to silence like monks return to monasteries. It's not just peace they're seeking, it's clarity. Because in the stillness, the illusions fall away. The ego quiets down. The mind gets tired of its own chatter. And what's left is something raw, real, undistorted. Of course, silence doesn't always feel like revelation. Sometimes it's boring. Sometimes it's terrifying. Sometimes it feels like staring into a black hole with no guarantee that anything will stare back. And that's exactly the point, because it forces you to confront what's underneath all the distractions. Not what you pretend to be, not what you tell others, but what you are beneath all stories. And maybe that's why so many ancient philosophies put silence at the beginning of wisdom. Because silence doesn't lie. It can't. It has no words to twist, no agenda to push, no image to project. Silence just waits. And in that waiting, it invites the truth to rise. Not on command, but in its own time. There's something disorienting about that. We're used to controlling things, asking, answering, knowing. But silence resists that. It doesn't give you what you want. It gives you what you need. And what we often need, more than anything else, is the chance to stop pretending we know what we're doing. To stop filling the air with noise just to reassure ourselves that we exist. To sit still long enough to realize that we're already enough, even without the performance. So perhaps the greatest philosophical act is not to speak, but to listen. Not to argue, but to observe. Not to explain, but to simply be. And if that sounds passive, remember this. Some of the most radical changes in the human heart begin not with a word, but with a pause. There's something quietly heroic about a man who chooses not to speak, not out of fear, but out of principle. Imagine this: Athens, the cradle of Western thought, a city of debate, drama, democracy. Words were power here. Oratory was weapon and shield. To speak well was to be seen as wise, worthy, civilized. And then there was Socrates, a man who, oddly enough, built his reputation not by speaking endlessly, but by knowing when not to. Sure, we remember him for his questions, his provocations, his long dialogues recorded by Plato. But there's a detail often overlooked. Socrates claimed he had a voice inside him, a daimonion, a kind of inner guide that didn't tell him what to do, but told him when to stop, when not to act, when not to speak. That voice, he said, kept him from making mistakes, and he obeyed it with more loyalty than any law or ruler. Think about that for a moment. The man who shaped the entire tradition of Western philosophy believed the deepest wisdom in him wasn't what he said, but what he withheld. That's not just an ancient anecdote. That's a radical idea. Because we live in a time where saying something, anything, has become a reflex. Opinions are expected. Silence is often condemned. To be silent in the face of a question is to be accused of ignorance, or worse, of complicity. But Socrates reminds us that sometimes the wisest thing is not to answer at all. Sometimes not responding is the only honest response. And maybe that's because language, for all its brilliance, is also a trap. The moment you say something, you limit it. You pin it down. You frame it in one perspective, and in doing so, exclude others. Plato himself admitted this. He called writing a kind of inferior imitation of real thought. Because once a word is written, it can't defend itself. It can't adapt. It can't evolve. It's frozen, no longer alive. So the greatest teacher in Western history, Plato, devoted his life to the written word, and simultaneously distrusted it. He knew its power, but he also knew its limits. That's why silence in his work is not always absence. Sometimes it's a form of resistance, a protest against the reduction of truth into slogans, sound bites, and declarations. In the Phaedrus, Plato even suggests that the deepest truths can't be written or spoken at all. They must be experienced in the soul, directly, like a flame passing from one heart to another. And for that to happen, words must eventually fall away. That idea runs like a quiet undercurrent through much of Western thought, though it rarely gets the spotlight. Kierkegaard, centuries later, wrote entire books trying to explain that the most important truths, faith, love, despair, couldn't be taught through logic. They had to be lived. And often, they had to be suffered. He called it the teleological suspension of the ethical. But maybe he could have just said, some things are too big for words. Wittgenstein, the towering philosopher of language in the 20th century, took this even further. He ended his famous Tractatus with a single sentence that echoes like a gong in the silence of philosophical history. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. In other words, if something cannot be clearly, logically stated, then it's not just hard to express. It's sacred, and it should be left untouched. That's not a retreat. That's a boundary. A line drawn in the sand between what can be named and what must be reverenced. And yet, this kind of silence, the kind that holds truth, is hard to accept. Especially in a world where every thought, every belief, every moment is expected to be shared. We are incentivized to speak constantly, post constantly, react constantly. To pause, to say nothing, is to risk being forgotten, or misunderstood, or irrelevant. But what if silence is the only way not to be irrelevant? What if it's the only way to resist being absorbed into the noise? There's a power in refusing to participate in the endless churn of opinions. Not because you don't care, but because you care too deeply to reduce the sacred into sound. Not because you have nothing to say, but because you understand that not all truths survive being spoken. And that's why silence, at its core, is a discipline. It's not just what happens when noise stops. It's something you choose. You cultivate it. You protect it. You listen not just with your ears, but with your being. You stop interrupting the world with yourself long enough to let the world speak back. That might sound poetic, but it's also deeply practical. Because think about how much damage we do, how much confusion, how much hurt, because we speak too soon. We speak without listening. We speak to fill a space instead of holding it. What would happen if, in moments of tension, of conflict, of pain, we responded not with instant words, but with a breath, a pause, a moment of silence that said, I'm here, I'm listening, I'm willing to not know. In that space, everything softens. The need to be right, the urge to defend, the desire to impress. It all fades, and what remains is something much more human, something fragile, something real. And maybe that's the secret the ancient philosophers knew, that silence is not the opposite of philosophy. It's the soil from which philosophy grows. Before the question, before the answer, before the debate, there is silence. Waiting. Today, silence is no longer sacred. It's something to be escaped, something to be filled. Walk down a street and count how many people are alone with their thoughts. You won't find many. Everyone's wired in, headphones in ears, eyes glued to screens, thumbs swiping through content, not because they need it, but because the silence feels unbearable. We don't fear darkness. We fear stillness. Because stillness forces us to listen, not to others, but to ourselves. And what we hear in that silence isn't always kind. It might be a whisper of doubt, a buried memory, a truth we've avoided. So we run. We fill every space with sound. Podcasts, music, videos, social media. We pretend it's productivity. But often, it's just a clever way to hide from ourselves. And the tragic irony is this. In a world more connected than ever, we've never been more out of touch. With ourselves, with each other, with the silence that once rooted us. We mistake silence for loneliness. But they're not the same. Loneliness is the hunger for connection. Silence is the presence of everything you've been avoiding. And that's why it's hard. Because silence tells the truth. And in a culture that rewards distraction, truth can feel like an enemy. But here's the secret that most people miss. Silence isn't just a void. It's a mirror. When the noise stops, what's left is you. Your thoughts, your fears, your longings, your forgotten dreams. All the things that are too quiet to compete with algorithms and autoplay. All the things that still matter. And maybe that's why silence feels so strange now. Because it forces a confrontation. Not with the world, but with ourselves. We've trained our minds to be always on, always scrolling, always reacting. So when silence comes, it doesn't feel like peace. It feels like withdrawal, like coming off a drug. But what if that discomfort is exactly the point? What if the first step toward clarity isn't another idea, but a pause? What if healing begins not with more information, but with the courage to sit in stillness and let the noise inside us settle? Think about the last time you truly experienced silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of stillness. No background music, no notifications, no multitasking, just you in a room, doing nothing but being. How long did it last? A minute? 10? An hour? Or did you escape before it could even begin? We say we want peace, but peace requires space, and space requires silence. There is no shortcut. This isn't just poetic, it's neurological. Studies in cognitive science have shown that silence actually helps the brain regenerate. It enhances memory, sparks creativity, reduces stress. When your mind isn't bombarded by constant input, it begins to organize itself. Connections form, ideas surface. You begin to notice things, not out there, but in here. And that noticing is where insight lives. So when we avoid silence, we're not just avoiding discomfort. We're avoiding transformation. And the cost is steep. We lose our attention. We lose our depth. We begin to skim life instead of sinking into it. We forget how to listen, not just to others, but to ourselves. Our thoughts become shorter. Our patience thins. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, our inner world shrinks until we begin to mistake stimulation for meaning. But stimulation is not the same as connection. Noise is not the same as understanding, and speech is not the same as truth. The truth is what waits in the pause, in the breath between questions, in the silence after a moment of pain or awe or love. That's where we meet the real, and yet we rush past it, every time, out of habit, out of fear, out of momentum. But we don't have to. We can reclaim silence, not as an escape, but as a return, a homecoming, a reset. Start small. 10 minutes in the morning without your phone, a walk without headphones, a meal eaten in quiet, not as a performance, not as a ritual, just as an opening. And when the discomfort rises, and it will, don't run from it. Sit with it. Let it say what it came to say. Because buried in that discomfort is usually a message. And buried in that message is often the thing you've been trying to find everywhere else. Peace, clarity, purpose. It's all in the silence. Not waiting to be shouted, just waiting to be heard. This is not a rejection of words. Words matter. Stories matter. Communication is a miracle. But when we speak without silence, our words lose their roots. They become like leaves without a tree. Pretty, maybe, but easily blown away. Real wisdom is not how much you say. It's how deeply you've listened before speaking. And listening begins in silence. Silence between people can feel like a void or a presence. It all depends on what lives inside it. Between lovers, silence can be intimacy, the kind that needs no translation. Two people sitting together, not speaking, not needing to. The silence itself becomes a kind of language, richer than words could ever be. You look at someone, and they look back, and nothing is said, yet everything is known. But silence can also hurt. When it's cold, when it's withholding, when it's used as a wall rather than a window. Anyone who's ever experienced the silent treatment knows the ache, not of noise, but of absence, of being erased, not with anger, but with quiet. In those moments, silence is not peace, it's punishment. That's the paradox of human silence. It's not neutral. It carries meaning, and what it means depends on the space between two people. The history, the emotion, the trust. A minute of silence in a courtroom is solemnity. A minute of silence after a fight is tension. A minute of silence on a first date might be awkward. The same minute, after years together, might feel like home. We are always interpreting silence, often more than we interpret words, because words can lie. Silence feels truer, rawer, less filtered. That's why it unnerves us. We're left to fill in the blanks, to guess what's unsaid. We project our hopes, our fears, our doubts into that space. And sometimes, that space becomes a mirror of everything we carry. But it doesn't have to be. When silence is intentional, when it's shared, it becomes sacred. Think of two people in grief, sitting together, saying nothing. What could they possibly say? What words could carry that weight? And yet their silence speaks, not of emptiness, but of presence, of solidarity, of love that's too deep to need explaining. This is the silence that heals, the kind that holds, the kind that says, I don't need to fix you, I'm just here. But we've forgotten how to hold that space. We rush to fill it, with advice, with distraction, with noise, because silence feels like inactivity, and inactivity feels like failure. But maybe the most important thing we can do for someone isn't to speak, but to stay, to sit quietly in their chaos, to resist the urge to solve, to be there, not above, not outside, but with. That takes courage, more courage than speaking, because speaking gives us control. Silence asks us to surrender, to listen without a plan, to be present without performance. And yet, in that surrender, connection is born. There's a kind of listening that doesn't begin with the ears. It begins in silence, before the other person even speaks. It's an openness, a willingness to receive, not just words, but being. It says, I'm not waiting for my turn to talk. I'm not filtering you through my judgments. I'm not trying to fix or change or correct you. I'm just here, listening, with nothing between us but space. That's rare. And when someone gives you that kind of silence, you feel it. You soften. You open. You say things you didn't know you were carrying. You find clarity, not because they gave you answers, but because they gave you space. And what we don't always realize is that we can give that to ourselves too. Sometimes the most important conversation isn't to the one we have with others. It as the one we have with ourselves. And the only way to hear it is through silence. We spend so much of our lives running from ourselves, filling every pause with movement, with noise, with opinion. But healing doesn't shout. Insight doesn't scream. They whisper. And if you don't create the silence, you'll never hear them. So the next time you find yourself in silence, with a friend, with a partner, with a stranger, don't rush to fill it. Stay. Feel the weight of it, the shape of it. Ask yourself, what lives here? Is it tension? Is it comfort? Is it fear? Is it love? And then ask, what happens if I just let it be? Because sometimes silence doesn't need to be understood. It just needs to be honored. In a world that teaches us to speak, to argue, to define, maybe the most radical thing we can do is not speak, not as retreat, but as reverence, for the other, for ourselves, for the unspeakable things between us. Creativity doesn't begin with inspiration. It begins with emptiness, a blank page, a quiet room, a silent question. All creation begins in the absence of something. And that absence, that silence, is not the enemy. It's the source. Before the first word of a novel is written, there is silence. Before the first brushstroke touches canvas, silence. Before a melody finds its way into sound, it waits in the hush before the note. The greatest artists, thinkers, and creators don't just tolerate silence. They trust it. They make space for it. They let it speak first. Because silence is not nothing. It's the raw material from which something can be made. This is why the best ideas often come not in the chaos of doing, but in the quiet after. In the shower, on a walk, in the middle of the night when the world has finally gone to sleep, and your thoughts can rise without competition. That's not coincidence. That's design. Our minds need silence to connect dots, to see patterns, to listen to what we already know, but have forgotten how to hear. And yet, we resist it. We sit down to write and check our phone. We try to create and distract ourselves. We fear the quiet because it demands more than noise ever will. Noise lets us off the hook. Silence asks us to look inward. And when we do, we often find something wild, unpredictable, original. That's what real creativity is. Not producing content, but encountering something we didn't expect, even in ourselves. But silence is more than a tool. It's a partner. Listen to a great piece of music, and you'll notice it's not just the notes that move you. It's the spaces between them, the pause before the crescendo, the breath before the drop, the moment of stillness that makes the sound feel sacred. Without silence, music is just noise. Without silence, words are just chatter. Without silence, thought becomes a loop with no entry point. This is true in art, but it's also true in life. Our modern world pushes us to always produce, always share, always be loud. But creation is not performance. It's not reaction. It's revelation. And revelation requires silence. The kind that isn't trying to prove anything. The kind that isn't waiting for applause. The kind that simply is. Open, quiet, ready. Some of the most profound breakthroughs in history came not from brainstorming sessions, but from long walks, quiet contemplation, nights spent alone staring into space. Newton under a tree. Einstein imagining himself riding a beam of light. Virginia Woolf pacing in silence, waiting for language to catch up with her insight. Silence is not the opposite of genius. It's its birthplace. We forget this because we're taught to measure value by visibility. If it isn't seen, it doesn't count. But the real work often happens in the unseen. In the hours no one watches. In the stillness no one shares. The world may never applaud your silence, but your soul will. And maybe that's the point. To create something true, something that lasts, we have to descend below the noise. We have to get quiet enough to hear what's asking to be born. And that doesn't happen when we're constantly reacting. It happens when we stop, when we let go, when we allow the silence to speak before we do. And what it says, more often than not, is this: you already know. You already have the seed. You just haven't slowed down long enough to plant it. This is where art begins, not in trying harder, but in listening deeper. So the next time you feel blocked, uninspired, empty, don't panic. Don't run to fill the void. Sit in it. Trust it. That emptiness is not failure. It's preparation. A quiet place where something new is gathering strength. And if you're patient enough, if you stay long enough, if you don't flinch, what comes next may surprise you. Because silence is not the absence of sound. It's the presence of possibility. And the artist, whatever form their work takes, is not the one who avoids silence, but the one who enters it willingly. Not to escape the world, but to meet it more deeply. Not to disconnect, but to reawaken. Not to disappear, but to return with something worth saying. And when they do speak, or write, or paint, or build, it's not noise, it's signal. Because it came not from ego, but from listening. And that kind of listening is rare, sacred, needed, now more than ever. Silence isn't only private, it can also be political. It can shape power or challenge it. Silence in the hands of authority can erase people, erase history, erase truth. Dictators understand this well. They silence critics not just with threats, but by making speaking impossible, by making words vanish. A banned book, a censored film, an imprisoned journalist. They're all messages, crafted in silence. They say, here's what cannot be said. Here's what must remain hidden. But silence doesn't only belong to oppressors. It can also belong to the oppressed, to those who choose silence not as submission, but as defiance. Gandhi famously took days of silence not just as spiritual discipline, but as political resistance. By refusing speech, he forced the British Empire and the world to listen differently, to pay attention not to what was shouted, but to what was quietly asserted. Dignity, sovereignty, justice. Silence, in that context, became louder than speech ever could be. Think about silent protests today. A crowd gathered in stillness. A moment of silence after tragedy. A kneeling athlete refusing to chant along. Why do these silent gestures feel so powerful? Because silence doesn't argue. It doesn't debate. It simply exists, stubbornly, undeniably present. It forces you to notice what you'd rather ignore, to acknowledge what words can easily dismiss. In silence, a protester doesn't need to shout, because silence amplifies the injustice itself. It says, unmistakably, Something here isn't right. Something here cannot be reduced to a slogan. Something here demands more than words. It demands attention. Yet this kind of silence, intentional, powerful silence, is harder than it seems. Because silence takes courage. It means stepping away from explanations, defenses, and narratives that protect us. It means standing raw and vulnerable, trusting that the truth doesn't always need to be justified, just witnessed. And the world fears this silence, because it cannot be controlled. It cannot be easily answered. It doesn't respond to threats, propaganda, or manipulation. It just stays, quiet, unyielding, undeniable. Consider someone pleading the Fifth Amendment in court, refusing to testify against themselves. That silence is not surrender. It's sovereignty. It's a fundamental human right not to be forced to incriminate yourself. Silence, in that moment, is dignity. It's an assertion of autonomy, of boundaries. It says, "You cannot compel me to speak against myself. My silence belongs to me." But this right to silence isn't universal. It must be protected. Because silence, like speech, can be taken away. It can be coerced. It can become violence. This happens every day. When voices are erased, when histories are buried, when entire groups are rendered invisible. Silence, then, is weaponized. It becomes complicity. The philosopher Michel Foucault wrote extensively about this. Silence doesn't just conceal truth, it shapes it. It decides whose stories matter and whose don't. It sets the boundaries of what's speakable and what isn't. Yet even under such silencing, silence itself can become rebellion. Prisoners who refuse to speak under interrogation, activists who won't name names, journalists who won't betray sources, no matter the cost. Silence in these moments is sacrifice. It's solidarity. It's resistance. That's the paradox of silence. It can oppress, or it can liberate. It can be compliance, or it can be rebellion. The difference isn't silence itself. It's who chooses it, who controls it, and who honors it. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a segregated bus, her quiet defiance said more than any speech could. Her silence, her simple refusal, echoed louder than any argument, because her silence wasn't just personal, it was historic. It shifted power precisely by refusing to participate in a conversation that was unjust to begin with. And this is why silence matters, not just as a philosophical curiosity, but as a moral tool. It's not passive, it's active. It chooses carefully what deserves words and what doesn't. Silence asks us to listen first, to understand deeply, and only then, if needed, to speak. In a culture obsessed with hot takes, viral outrage, instant reactions, silence becomes radical. It says, "I refuse to perform. I refuse to reduce my humanity to a soundbite. My beliefs, my principles, my dignity, these cannot be captured by noise. They deserve something deeper, something quieter, something stronger." And here's the beauty of it. The quieter you are, the louder your actions become. Silence isn't just absence, it's space. And into that space, your integrity steps forward. Your choices become clearer. Your values become unmistakable. You become not what you say, but what you do. This is why oppressive regimes fear silence as much as they fear speech. Because silence, authentic, intentional, courageous silence, cannot be easily countered. It can't be twisted, it can't be debated, it simply exists defiantly as proof of something that cannot be denied. So, when you face injustice or power that demands your voice against your will, remember, silence, too, is speech. It's a choice, it's a statement, and sometimes it says more clearly, more powerfully, more authentically than any words ever could. At the heart of all philosophy lies one question: who am I? This question is both simple and profoundly unsettling. We often try to answer it with words, with roles, with labels, our jobs, our relationships, our beliefs. But every label eventually falls short. Every answer leads to more questions. Because who you are isn't a fixed idea. It's an experience, constantly unfolding, constantly changing. And nowhere does this become clearer than in silence. In silence, identity doesn't vanish. It deepens. It reveals itself. Not as something defined by words or achievements, but as a quiet awareness that watches it all. Philosophers call this awareness consciousness, the silent witness behind every thought, every emotion, every experience you've ever had. It's the part of you that hasn't aged, even as your body changes. It's the part of you that remains steady, even as your beliefs and ideas shift. It's always been there, observing, noticing, silently holding space. But what happens when you turn your attention away from the noise, from the stories you tell yourself, and toward this silent observer? You begin to see something fascinating. Your thoughts aren't you. Your feelings aren't you. Your memories, even your personality, they're all passing phenomena. Important, yes, but temporary. Like clouds moving across the sky remains, clear, silent, unchanged. This is exactly what existential philosophers like Sartre and Camus explored, though they didn't always name it as silence. Sartre famously wrote that human beings are condemned to be free. But what does that freedom actually mean? It means there's no predetermined meaning handed down to us. We are left alone, standing in silence, facing a universe that does not provide answers, only endless, open-ended questions. For Sartre, this silence was terrifying. It meant responsibility. It meant that meaning was not something you discovered. It was something you created, moment by moment. Life didn't have built-in explanations. It was quiet, open, empty, waiting to be filled. This emptiness wasn't comforting. It felt like standing at the edge of a vast, silent abyss. Camus went even further, calling life absurd precisely because it doesn't answer back. You can shout your questions into the void, but the void, the silent cosmos, does not respond, at least not with words. And that silence, that absolute refusal of the universe to explain itself, is the starting point of true philosophical courage. It demands that we create meaning, knowing full well the universe may never validate it. Yet existentialists weren't the first to confront this silence. Long before Sartre or Camus, philosophers in ancient traditions, particularly Buddhism and Zen, embraced silence not as emptiness or absurdity, but as liberation. They agreed that the universe was silent, that it didn't provide ready-made meanings, but instead of despairing, they turned toward that silence. They meditated upon it. They sat with it. They learned to trust it, not as emptiness, but as openness, as potential. Zen masters spoke of silence as the highest form of wisdom, because only silence was big enough to contain reality itself, without distortion or judgment. The Zen monk doesn't meditate to escape reality, but to meet it fully, to meet life exactly as it is, unfiltered, raw, immediate. And what they discover in silence is not emptiness, but fullness, not isolation, but connection. They realize something profound. Beneath words, beneath concepts, beneath the noise of the mind, they are not separate from the universe. They are part of it. They are it. This realization doesn't come from explanation. It comes from silence. It comes from the direct experience of being. And this experience can't be spoken, only lived. And here's the paradox. The more deeply you enter silence, the less lonely you become. Because silence dissolves the illusion of separateness. You see clearly that your consciousness, the silent witness, is not isolated. It's part of something larger, something universal, something silent, yes, but alive, aware, infinitely present. But most of us rarely touch this silence. We live on the surface of life, skimming from moment to moment, driven by noise, distracted by fear, caught in the never-ending stories we tell ourselves. But silence invites you to drop beneath the stories, to let go of the need for constant explanation, to simply be. When you stop labeling yourself, when you stop trying to explain yourself, something remarkable happens. You discover freedom. Not freedom in the sense of escaping responsibility, but freedom from the stories that limit you. Freedom from always needing to prove, justify, defend who you are. In silence, your identity becomes fluid, open, flexible. It doesn't shrink, it expands. Because you realize something astonishing. You're not just who you thought you were. You're not confined to your history or your ideas or your roles. You're something larger, quieter, more mysterious. You're the awareness itself. You're the silence behind the noise, the stillness beneath the movement. And this stillness, this silent consciousness, is always available, always here. All you have to do is notice. So, when existentialists speak of freedom, when mystics speak of liberation, when philosophers speak of knowing yourself, this is what they mean. They mean stepping away from words, from labels, from constant noise, and resting in the silent, spacious awareness that holds it all. And it's right there, waiting, beneath every thought you've ever had, beneath every identity you've ever claimed. It's who you really are, underneath everything else. It's not something you find. It's something you remember. And silence is the path that takes you there. After all this talk about silence, perhaps you're starting to see the irony. The more we speak about it, the further we seem to drift from its essence. Words pile up, explanations multiply, but silence itself remains elusive, quietly waiting beyond the reach of language. And yet, maybe that's exactly the point. Perhaps all philosophy, all human seeking, is just a series of attempts to describe something that resists description. Something vast, subtle, mysterious, something always just beyond our grasp, yet unmistakably real. Because silence is not something we invent. It's something we discover. It was here before us, and it'll remain long after we've stopped speaking. It's older than philosophy, older than language itself. It's woven into the very fabric of existence. Beneath every conversation, every thought, every breath, silence waits, patient, unchanging, open. So maybe the question isn't how we define silence, or even what silence means, but what silence asks of us. Because silence does ask something. It asks us to pause, to step back from the constant noise, to let go of the need to always understand, always explain, always know. It asks us to trust something deeper, something quieter, something that words can never fully capture. This isn't easy. Silence requires courage. It means facing the unknown, not once, but again and again. It means embracing uncertainty. It means surrendering the illusion of control. It means admitting that some things, perhaps the most important things, can't be explained, only lived. But when we find the courage to listen deeply, to truly become quiet, something incredible happens. We discover we're not alone. That silence isn't empty. It's filled with life, with possibility, with presence. In silence, we remember what it means to be fully human. Not defined by roles or labels or achievements, but by awareness, by connection, by the simple yet profound experience of being here. This is why silence matters, not just as an idea, but as practice, as a commitment, as a daily act of rebellion against a culture that demands constant noise, constant reaction, constant distraction. Silence is revolutionary. It says, I refuse to live on autopilot. I refuse to become numb. I choose instead to be present, aware, awake. But silence isn't passive. It's active. It asks you not just to listen, but to respond differently, more thoughtfully, more compassionately, more authentically. Because once you've touched real silence, once you've experienced the peace, clarity, and insight it brings, you carry it with you. It shapes your conversations, your relationships, your decisions. You speak less, but you say more. Your presence deepens, your understanding grows, and slowly, almost without realizing it, your whole life begins to change. The noise no longer controls you. You begin to hear what matters most, not the loudest voice, but the truest. Not the quickest reaction, but the clearest intention. Your actions become deliberate, thoughtful, aligned. Your relationships become richer, calmer, more genuine. This isn't philosophy anymore. It's wisdom, not theoretical, but lived. Because ultimately, silence doesn't just show you who you are, it shows you who you can become. It doesn't just reflect the world, it helps transform it. Imagine a world where leaders listened before speaking, where debates paused before becoming arguments, where relationships made room for silence rather than rushing to judgment. Imagine the difference it would make if we all practiced silence, not just individually, but collectively. A moment of quiet before a harsh word, a pause before reacting out of fear or anger, a space held open for empathy, understanding, reflection. How much conflict might be avoided? How many misunderstandings cleared up? How many truths revealed? This world isn't impossible. It begins with you, with your willingness to sit quietly, even when the world insists you speak, with your courage to listen deeply, even when it's uncomfortable, with your commitment to hold silence as sacred, even when others dismiss it as irrelevant. Because silence matters. It's not just philosophy. It's a way of life, a way of being in the world that honors something deeper than words, something more real than argument, something truer than explanations. It's the quiet core of every meaningful life, and it's always available, waiting just beneath the noise, waiting patiently for you to notice it. So, the next time you encounter silence, don't rush to fill it. Stay there, listen, feel the quiet beneath the noise. Allow it to teach you, guide you, remind you who you really are. Because silence isn't absence, it's presence. It's the language of truth. It's the space where life itself becomes clear. And when all words fall away, when language fails and explanations vanish, silence remains, unspoken, unbroken, infinite, waiting patiently, with open arms, welcoming you back to yourself. Because the real question isn't what silence reveals about being, but what being reveals about silence. And the answer isn't something you can speak, it's something you must live. So embrace it, trust it, honor it. Because ultimately, silence isn't emptiness, it's home. If you've enjoyed exploring the philosophy of silence with me today, please like this video and subscribe for more deep dives into the fascinating questions of existence. Remember, sometimes the most important thing you can say is nothing at all. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the silence.